Here we go. It's time for another edition of ACC Baseball Etc., presented as always by Pitch Logic. It's the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. It is an easy-to-use and affordable technology that makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics, all the features used at the highest level. You can go to pitchlogic.com for more information. I'm telling you, if you are a pitcher of any kind, as I just mentioned, at any level, I think it's something that would be of interest to you. I got the full demo from our friend Larry Sorensen, and it's cool. KP, I want to go play a game of catch with you. Maybe we make it happen in Omaha this year and do it with the Pitch Logic ball so that we can just see what's going on with the spin and the angle and all that sort of stuff.
I'm happy to see what your metrics are. I don't know that I necessarily want to see what mine are anymore, but I'll catch it and flip it to somebody else. They can throw it back to you.
Love it. Love it. Kyle Peterson is the other voice on the other side. He's filling in for Danny Graves, who's out again. He's doing big league stuff this week. So we literally are getting big leagued by Gravy again. But
that makes sense.
He'll be back next week. Although you and Gravy have something in common in that, or you're going to at the start of next season, in that you will be ACC legends. I'm using my air quotes.
That doesn't sound right, but yeah, I guess it's going to be that time. It's still crazy to me. Watching the last year of the Pac and everything's going on, we saw it through the basketball season and now with baseball. There's an exciting component to it if you're Stanford and Cal, just because of what you're walking into and the power of the conference. There's also, I think, a little bit of a confusing component to it because you just need to figure out who everybody is and how to get there. There's not a lot of twice daily SFO to Charlottesville's that I'm aware of. So travel's going to be a little bit different, but I know that those that are coming into it in Stanford and Cal standpoint are probably a little bit disappointed to see the Pac go away, and at the same time excited to be in the ACC.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to get into some ACC baseball talk. What a fun couple of weeks that we've had just throughout college baseball, and I'm looking beyond the ACC. We got a Jack Caglione walk-off home run. We just a lot of fun stuff happening, including yet another couple of walk-off victories for NC State. That's 5 on the season for them. They are one of 8 teams ranked in the top 25 as of this morning. A sweep. North Carolina, maybe the biggest statement of the weekend in college baseball. North Carolina sweeping at Wake Forest, pushing themselves into a top 10 spot. Just a lot of great stuff happening throughout the league. And there's a question that I sort of want us to exercise through.
Okay. Now,
4 teams in Omaha is the most ever by a conference in a single year. SEC's done it, I think, 5 times. The ACC has done it only once. But that's the mark. Now, when I tee you up on this, I don't mean it as, okay, these are your predictions for teams that will make it to Omaha. We all know there are always, in every single season, more teams capable of making it to Omaha than there are spots in Omaha. So I'm curious, with 8 in the top 25, and it's a far cry from Wake Forest and everybody else like it was last year.
Yeah.
How many Omaha capable teams do you think there are in the ACC? And by that, I simply mean, given their makeup, draws certainly matter with regionals and super regionals, of course, but given their makeup, you think they are an Omaha caliber team. There is some pathway for them to make it to the College World Series.
Well, I think part of that you got to look about how people have made runs, and ultimately, I want to see what happens on a weekend as opposed to the entirety. I know that sounds a little bit different, but really the postseason is set up as a glorified 3-game series, especially at the beginning, and especially if you win the first 2 in a regional. That winning game 2 if you win game 1, winning game 2 of a regional is probably the most important of a postseason run, just because it puts you in such an advantageous pitching position. So I kind of go back to that, to where who do you think can pitch game one and game two of a weekend series, regardless of what all the other metrics say right now. And to me, if you can do that, you got a chance to go into any situation and win the first two. So I would tell you, I think there may be 9. Now, as far as are they built in a way to where you can win the first 2 games of region, you get to a super, anybody can win. I mean, history has shown us that. Obviously, there's advantage to playing at home, and the way that the conference is set up right now, you know, you're probably going to have 3 national seeds if you did it today. You're going to have at least 2, but potentially could have 3. And there's the biggest advantage. But that host piece the first weekend is a massive advantage. So, yeah, I mean, I'd say you're 8 that are ranked, and I wouldn't throw Miami out quite yet. I mean, I think that Miami has enough. They've got enough thump. Clearly, I mean, they haven't pitched it quite as well as some others, but I think they're balanced enough that if you put them in a regional, they got a chance to win the first 2 games. And you get a chance to win the first 2 games, you know, they're going to be doing it as a 2 seed, potentially a 3, unless things change from here on out, which they can. I mean, you know, we can be talking about this in 4 weeks, and Miami could have gone 8-4 the last 2 weeks, and now we're saying, are they going to host? But that's why I would expand it. I would take your 8 ranked teams, and I would add Miami as a club that, yeah, if they get in and get hot, sure, you can make an argument there. But going back to it, I mean, I realistically, I think if you get 2 or 3, it's a darn good year, whoever those 2 or 3 might be.
Yeah, no kidding. I like your starting point of starting pitching, and that is what makes what's happening currently in the league kind of interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned you and I texted about Florida State after you had their game with Florida in the midweek a couple of weeks ago. And you mentioned to me that you thought they were legit, and it had a lot to do with the 2 starting pitchers, Cam Leiter, Jamie Arnold. You had mentioned to me at the time, it is now sort of further crystallized that Jamie Arnold was the better of the 2 to that point. I think I saw he's number 5 in our latest D1 baseball positional rankings at starting pitcher. So, I mean, he's had frankly, an insane year so far through 7 starts, 0.66 ERA. But you look across the teams that might be considered for this spot, and those 2 ace-like starting pitchers, that's not the case for everybody. In fact, North Carolina, who made the biggest statement of the weekend, their Friday and Saturday guys are both true freshmen, one of which is not even quite 18 years old yet, I don't think. I mean, he's the youngest player in Division I college baseball. So there's some disparity in that. What would you say if a 1 and 2 starting pitcher combo is sort of the gives you the greatest chance? What would you say comes next? What's like the B tier? Yeah.
I still think both, and I always start with pitching because, especially if you lose a game in a regional, if you can't pitch it, you're probably not just going to slug your way through a loser's bracket. And depending on ballpark and weather, you may not be able to slug your way through anything. You know, you kind of, to me, I point to Virginia Tech. Like, I mean, they're one of the most offensive teams in the league. Also benefited by playing at home. But if Virginia Tech keeps doing what they're doing, they're going to play at home. And so it negates, well, if you go on the road and you go wherever that isn't quite as offensive. In reality, most places are pretty offensive right now. But they play great in their own ballpark. And he hit a ton of home runs, and there's advantage to doing that. Wake historically has been that way. I know it was a little bit different this weekend. But how many home runs did North Carolina hit this weekend? 14 or 15?
14.
Yeah,
including 4 off of Chase Burns, who seemed untouchable prior to this weekend. Yeah,
I saw him 3 weeks ago against Virginia, and he was untouchable. I mean, they hit a solo home run and a backside ground ball, and that was it in 6 innings. And there weren't any other barrels, and Virginia can really hit. I mean, if any offense top to bottom that I've seen in the league, I think Virginia probably has the best balanced offense. And he owned him that day. So, yeah, I would say bullpen is next, which you look to Duke. I think you're going to look to Wake by the time we get to the end of the year, but time will tell. If they get everybody back and healthy and the back end of that bullpen looks the way that they want it to, then I think you're going to look at Wake and say, okay, this is going to play towards the end of the year. You know, Florida State, even though fairly young and somewhat inexperienced with some of those bullpen guys, has been pretty good coming out of the bullpen so far. And then you got to have enough slug. They're just the way that the game is played right now, you have to have enough slug because it's just if you don't hit home runs, you're probably not going to win. And I think that's one of the things that you got to look at. You don't have to hit 14 in a weekend, but there has to be the threat of hitting a home run, because that's the way the game is played right now. So those, I'd go 1-2, then I go bullpen, then I go, okay, show me the slug. And then you start getting down to who defends and some of the other things that has intangibles that they can't do. But that's kind of where I start when I look to the postseason is you give me 1-2 bullpen and some slug. Okay, that's a club that I think's got a fighting chance.
To this point, who in your mind, and Clemson is the highest ranked by the rankings, who's the best team in the ACC right now? Is it the Tigers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to argue with what they've done. What's interesting, you look back at that Florida State series, and if Florida State, doesn't blow 2 leads, are we saying Florida State is right now? Potentially. Right. But they did, and that's where, outside of that weekend, their bullpen hadn't been that bad outside of those 2 games, really. I mean, those 2 games are just outliers, and it was brutal. But aside from that, bullpen's been good enough. So I really like Florida State. I think you got to put Clemson there. It's interesting when you look at Clemson, like there's no, from an offensive standpoint, they're good. They're not great, but they're good. From a pitching standpoint, they're good, but they're not great. Like there's nothing from a team standpoint that you say, hey, it jumps off the board. However, across the board, it's super solid. And you're halfway through the season, you get 3 or 4 losses. Like at some point, the ball don't lie. And I think it's getting to that point for Clemson. And they've played some tough teams in the league already. I mean, you play Florida State at home, go on the road and play Miami. Those aren't gimmick weekends for anything. So I think you put Clemson first. I wouldn't put Virginia Tech too far behind just because of the way they play. But I really like Florida State. I know that North Carolina had a really good weekend. I got to see a little bit more to put them up there where they at. And I think by the end of the year, we're going to say, man, you really don't want to play Wake Forest right now. That may not be the case right now. I know what they are in the league. But now you get Kurtz back. You start getting bullpen arms back. I think when we look up in late May, Wake's going to be one of those teams. It may be a 2 seed, but Wake's going to be one of those teams that you say, yeah, you don't really want that draw.
Yeah. You mentioned needing to see more out of North Carolina. This is something that I've talked about with them since the Jake Knapp injury took away their experienced Friday ace, and they had to sort of slot everyone forward. So it's Boaz on Friday, DeCaro on Saturday. Again, those are 2 very, very important spots, and the guys have produced to this point. There is such a thing as a freshman wall, though. Like what they're battling or going to battle, to me, KP, is this sort of conflicting ideologies. One is that at some point, freshmen, especially true freshmen, become not freshmen, right? There's sort of a growing into it. There is a learning curve, at least in the first half or so of the season. And if it clicks, it starts to click probably right about now. Then there's that freshman wall, whereas especially as a starting pitcher, you get deeper into this college season. It's like, man, this is as long of a season as these guys have ever played. Yeah. Do you have like a theory on which of the 2 wins out there? Is it a person to person basis?
I think it's person to person. I mean, speaking from experience. So, I mean, my freshman year started out of the bullpen, came into the rotation a few weeks in, I think pitched every turn on the weekend during the course of the weekend, and had 10 complete games. Now, this is 25 years ago. Like, nobody's going to have 10 complete games anymore as a freshman. But when the season was over, I was done. But getting to that point was okay. So I think some of it is just balance. Like if you have, and it's harder in the league, especially when you're on a game 1, game 2, to where if you can have a few of those to where, you know what, we got an 8-1 lead in the 5th, and we're going to play for the rest of the season and get them out of there and keep them at 70 pitches today and call it good. A few of those are good to have moving forward, just so when you get to the back end, I mean, they're stretched out enough to where if you need them to go 105, 110 pitches, they can do it. But it doesn't mean you necessarily have to do it every week if the game doesn't dictate it. So I think that's an advantage moving forward, is if you have those weekends to where you jump on somebody early. and you can get one of those two kids out of there fairly early, then I think it's a benefit. Or, you know what, maybe you skip them a week. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world to say, listen, this is not performance-based. Like, we're going to skip you a week, or we're going to keep you to 40 this week just because we want to make sure we got your legs here in a few weeks. But I think your eye also tells you. I mean, the metrics tell you. Like, if everything is saying, hey, stuff is at the same level and it's not depleting at all, well, then maybe there's not necessarily a reason to do that, because usually the data is going to tell you, and it may not just be 1 week, but over the course of a few weeks, the data is going to tell you whether or not the stuff is ticking down or ticking up. And if the stuff looks the same and it's consistent the whole year, I mean, it's been done plenty. Would it be more of an outlier? Sure. Yeah, it would be, because nobody wants to do it unless you have to. I mean, in an ideal world, you're not pitching 2 freshmen on the weekend because you got older guys that can go out there and do it, and you kind of transition the other guys into it. But if you have to and it works, hell, ride it for as long as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. And offensively, I'll stick to North Carolina for one more here. Man, they can hit. I know that's further down the list, but holy cow, I think they're, in terms of a complete lineup, right up there with, you mentioned Virginia. Vance Honeycutt was 1 for 13 with 7 strikeouts, and they put up the runs that they did against Wake Forest. So you know, your best player, one of the best players in the country, has an off weekend, and you still pull off what you did.
Yeah.
Parks Harbor, we talked early in the year about the significance of the SEC to ACC transfers, and that's coming to fruition, right? Chase Burns has been remarkable for Wake Forest. Parks Harbor has been a huge lineup piece for North Carolina. He had 4 homers in the series, 6 for the week, I believe. I mean, a pretty easy check on my ballot for ACC Player of the Week. His OPS 2,000 plus for the week, which is, even in a small sample size, is absurd. They've got Alberto Osuna, who's healthy and can certainly take a ball deep, and even deeper than deep at a moment's notice. They've got guys who are just hitters, like Casey Cook. I look at a guy like Casey Cook, and he is just as complete a hitter as there is in college baseball to me. He had a couple of homers this weekend, but he's so much more than that. And then, you know, when Vance isn't doing his thing at the plate, he goes off and steals home in a game against Wake Forest. So, like, he can affect the game in so many ways, even when he's not hitting. And then the rest of the pieces put it together. They just have such balance, KP. Like, there's the home run swing ability with a guy like Osuna. There's you know, a guy like Cook, who's really more of an on-base guy. Their new pieces, D'Onofrio and Madura, have been great. It's a really complete lineup to me.
Well, and it's not one-dimensional, right? I think that's the biggest thing. When you have somebody like Honeycutt that struggles offensively but still has the ability to do things. I mean, Parks Harbor had 30 or 31 home runs the last 2 years at Georgia. I think he's got 9 or 10 already this year. I mean, he's probably going to hit you 20 plus. That's a big boost right in the middle of that lineup. And the other thing is, like, he's been there. I mean, what's going to happen for the back half of the season? There's no, aside from maybe going to ballparks he hadn't been in before, like the experience and the expectation and everything else. He's already been through it. And so I think there's a huge advantage to having that component, that even though he wasn't wearing that uniform, you know, it's a time of year that I think he knows and he's been pretty comfortable in. So, yeah, I mean, to my point of, I got to see more from North Carolina, it really more is just it's youth on the weekend and see if that can sustain. And if it sustains, then, yeah, you're looking at a potential top 8 national seed team the way that they've played up to this point, which, again, I mean, you go sweep Wake at Wake, that doesn't happen. And regardless of how you did it and who hit, I was more impressed, I think, by the Sunday game than anything else, because I mean, they're banging away, then Wake comes back. Then they're banging away, then Wake comes back. And it was enough. Like, you've already won the series. I mean, there is a natural human component to be like, damn it, man, we got 2. They're still firing. I don't know if we got enough today. And you know, you win a double-digit game in Game 3, which you're going to have to do in any league right now. Game 3 is always going to be offensive. But they kept taking punches and they kept firing back. And that's a pretty good sign, Game 3, in that environment.
Yeah. Yeah, Luke Stevenson, a couple of homers in that one, including
Yeah.
a one late for them to grab hold of the lead. I think that was in the top of the ninth for them. But just like a really gutsy game. Had you turned it on like mid-game when they were going back and forth and not seen the results from the previous two games, you would have thought, wow, both teams are playing like this is for the series. You would have thought they split the first two. So it was cool. It was good. Good baseball for sure. What do you think? What do you make of NC State? 2 walk-off victories over Notre Dame over the weekend. It's their 5th walk-off win of the season. Like, I feel like to this point in the season, and I'm going to call myself out on this, KP, like to this point in the season, Danny and I have given Miami a lot of credit for their, however you want to phrase it, having that dog in them or whatever it may be. They've just got a lot of fight in them, and we've seen some Mark Light magic in the form of walk-off wins for the Hurricanes this year. I think we have to say the same for NC State now, even though it didn't necessarily feel the same way earlier in the season.
No, what I would say with NC State is I think the schedule has been beneficial to them too. I mean, you look at the back half of their ACC schedule, and they go to Louisville next weekend, but then you go to Clemson, you get North Carolina at home, you get an off non-conference weekend, you go to Tallahassee, you go to Virginia, and you get Wake at home. Like, that's when you know. Yeah. And yes, obviously this is when you got to go out and make some hay because you're playing some teams earlier. And listen, I mean, they won a series against Duke, and I think Duke's absolutely could end up in Omaha. But the back half of that ACC year is going to be, I think, when we really know what NC State is. But that being said, like, you don't set the schedule, you play who they tell you to play. We've seen this across the country where there's some teams in other conferences that are looking really good right now. But when you start to look at what's coming next, that's when you really know how good they are. So I think that, I don't know, I think any team that Elliott has is going to fight. Like, that's just kind of who he is. And they may not line up and be the most talented that is in the league, but they're always going to have enough there. But I want to see what happens the back half, because that back half is real. I mean, the back half, you're playing, 2 to 3 potential national seeds in the last 5 weeks of the season. But that's how you get yourself into either host and be in that same category. So it's an opportunity, but it's also going to be a challenge here in a few weeks.
Yeah. And I, in comparing Miami and NC State, it's occurring to me as we're talking. The two are like, their makeup is kind of similar in that they've got some transfers in the lineup who have been producers for them. They've hit when they've needed it. And in the past 2 weeks now, their aces have been acing. Gage Zeal for Miami is coming off of a second consecutive really, really good start. Sam Highfill for NC State looks like the Sam Highfill of hard to believe it was 2021 when we sort of touted him as like the guy, and he's been there that long, and he's reaching back and finding that 2021 version of himself, or at least pieces of it for it. They're very similar now that I think about it, in that they've got a good experienced guy at the front end of the rotation who's finding it around this time. And again, you mentioned the schedule. Highfield, that start against Duke was phenomenal, right? I mean, that's a lineup that is tough to pitch to, and it's very real, and it's a lot of experience to meet his experience, even though most of the guys haven't been at Duke their whole careers. It's just it's smart hitting, and he does it without the stuff of a Chase Burns necessarily. He's not pumping it by you, right? But he's just crafty. There's a lot of pitchability there, and there's something like that to what Gage Zeal does for Miami too.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of college baseball. Like, we don't really, we like to talk about the prospects piece and who's going to go in the draft, but at the end of the day, if you win, you win. And that's, as you go up in levels, stuff becomes more important. I'd still prefer stuff, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, there's plenty of dudes that know how to pitch at 88 to 91 and get a bunch of outs. And what we've seen, I had Arkansas LSU this weekend, and Arkansas threw Mason Molina one day two, the transfer from Texas Tech, Mason Molina is 88, 89, but the metrics on the fastball play way up. And so he's learned. It was funny. We were talking, and I think you see this around the country. Like 20 years ago, if you get a left-hander that's 88, 89, even though it's a weird slot, you're turning him into a two-seam slider guy and change-ups, and we're going to try to get ground balls. And now velocity isn't necessarily the greatest indicator of what your stuff is. It's what actually plays. I mean, you go back to the pitch logic piece, like that's what pitch logic does. It shows you what the metrics are when you're doing it. And for a guy like Molina, the fastball plays totally different because it stays at the top of the zone and he's learned how to use it. And I think that's what you see with some of these guys that may not be like the super stuff guys, but ultimately understand what they are. And they have the ability to take what they are and lean on it instead of saying, I got to go out and throw 95. No, I mean, the good Lord doesn't bless everybody with the ability to throw 95. But now we have the ability to see what is your best stuff. And whatever we figure out your best stuff is, let's throw more of that, whatever it might be. And you don't need to throw 96 in order to figure out what that is.
Yeah. No, I think it's a point well taken. And, you know, in the case of Sam Highfill, especially, I mean, look, he again, I mentioned 2021. He got a couple of knocks off of Kumar Rocker because they needed somebody to fill in the lineup, right? That's kind of how we knew who he was in the college baseball world, but that's how the broader sports fan world found out about Highfill. And then it turns out it's like, oh, okay, he's a really good pitcher. The change
he can really pitch.
Plus, he's got something going there. So it's really cool to see him sort of back at it. And he had the lower back stuff last year that kept him from being 100%. That's a big value add for them, especially after losing Matt Willitson prior to the season starting. Because otherwise it would have been those three guys, Highfill, Whitaker, Willitson. And it's like, this is kind of the same rotation that they had in 2021. You know, it's just the guys who have been there, and that's NC State's not the only team with those types of guys. So you mentioned it, the beauty of college baseball. We've got the newcomers who impact it. We've got the guys who are just like the elder statesmen of one league or another. And, you know, week in and week out, they're going out there to prove that they've still got it.
I mean, you're seeing the Northeast onslaught too. And we've seen it, I mean, particularly from the Ivies. But from a lot in the Northeast that come in, and it's not just in the ACC, there's other examples of it, but you know, in the Ivies, you get 4 years, that's it. And obviously COVID was a component of that. And so you're getting some pretty experienced players that are coming in and filling pretty important roles on some of these clubs. And those are, I think it's going to be interesting in the next few years because, you know, rosters aren't going to be quite as old because all the COVID eligibility moves on.
Yeah.
And so now it's a little bit more realistic from what it was before, but you know, it's also this natural balance of how hard do I recruit freshmen and how hard do we go after the portal? And every year I think teams are understanding more how to use the portal, especially based on where you are. Like some places, you know, you can't play the Tommy White game. Like just financially, you're not going to have the ability to do it. And so let's go find a few that fit what we need. And then ultimately run on from there. I've said this to a few coaches this year. Like, man, I respect college coaches more now than I ever have before because the moving parts associated with everything non-baseball are more every day. And at least if the system sets up the way that it is now moving forward, that part's not going to change. I mean, you're recruiting high school guys, you're recruiting portal guys, you're recruiting your own guys, you're recruiting JUCO guys. And now we got to figure out what happens in the draft. Like that's before you make out a lineup card. That's just figuring out what your roster is going to look like. It's a crazy time in athletics, and particularly I think in baseball because the draft brings a different component that it does in any other game. Yeah,
it's. I mean, look, I mean, and you and I both talk to coaches pretty regularly about this sort of stuff. It is a really complicated mix, and it's alarming when you've got a guy like Eric Bakich at Clemson. Talk to you about the breakdown of what his offseason looked like and how small a percentage of it was actually recruiting. And that did happen when we talked to him preseason. That was the case. But then you look up and it's like, oh, you get a top 5 team, Eric. Like, must not have been that bad. Or you know, he's probably like you're breaking your back to make it all happen, and you're still doing it, right? So it's not that it's him complaining or being overly whiny when he says things like that, but it's interesting. I'm with you. It has changed the game for guys like that. So
Yeah.
it certainly stands to reason that some are going to be able to adapt better than others, which will be interesting to see over the years.
I do think the one thing I wish, I mean, we're seeing this in basketball in the middle of the tournament right now, though. I wish that the portal wouldn't start until the postseason's over.
Yeah.
I respect the ability for kids to get in there and figure out where they're going to go, but it's such a disadvantage to those that are actually still playing and fighting for a national championship. And it just seems to reason that with the draft move back a few weeks right now, that if you open the portal up, that Tuesday after game 3 of the finals, then ultimately everybody's on kind of the same relative, I guess, layout as far as who has advantages and disadvantages. But, if you open the portal up when it does right now and you go on a 3.5-week run, like you can't get anybody to campus. It doesn't mean you're not talking to anybody, but you can't really get anybody to campus. If so, it's like a Tuesday when you're trying to figure out who you're going to play in Omaha 3 days later. So that's the piece that we're in a portal world. I think it makes sense from a player standpoint because I think players should have the ability to at least once to go somewhere without any kind of repercussions. I just wish they'd wait a few weeks. I think it's better for everybody if you do it at that. There's still enough time before the draft. There's enough time before school starts, and everybody's playing on the same field at that point.
Yeah, and I don't know all the nuances to this specific example, but I started to mention him earlier. You talked about not everybody's going to be able to do the LSU to Tommy White to LSU thing. NC State went out and replaced a guy in Geno Groover, who was a very good third baseman for them, with someone from a non-conference in-state rival in East Carolina, and they've got Alec Makarevich playing at third for them, and it's been a tremendous fit. It was a bit controversial, I'll say, just as somebody based in North Carolina who saw a lot of the talk surrounding it when Alec announced he was transferring to NC State. But it's been the perfect fit. And without knowing his numbers from over the weekend off the top of my head, I know that entering the weekend, this is a switch hitting third baseman who typically has about a 100 batting average split between the two sides. And there's typically a little bit more pop from the left-handed side. That was always the book at ECU on him. Yeah. Well, entering the weekend, 10 home runs, 5 from each side. And the dude's just like, he's an ox. He's massive. I was doing the game in the Duke series with Andrew Sensen, former NC State infielder. And he and I went and watched BP for a little bit. Couple hours before the game, we were talking to Elliot and saw some guys in the cage. And this is a guy in Simpson who's around the NC State program a good bit. He's an alum. He gets the access even more than what we do. Yeah. And he was not aware of just how big and physical AMAC was. The look on his face when Makarevich walked into the cage and then he turned to me wide-eyed, he was just like, dude, that guy's big. No wonder when he gets a hold of one.
Yeah.
It flies. But the point being, with Makarevich, I remember after it was revealed that he was transferring to NC State over the summer, I saw Elliot at the USA Baseball National Training Complex for an event. And I mentioned to him, hey, I've done a lot of ECU games. I've seen a lot of Makarevich, really good player. All indications are he's a pretty good kid, too. And I was taken aback by Elliot saying, well, I hope he is. Like he would, the sense was he hasn't really gotten to talk to him, but that's because of that. It's because of the sort of microwaved nature by which you needed to just go ahead and grab him that you're talking about, right? It presents an opportunity that affords itself less of that, getting to know a guy before you bring him on campus.
I mean, I had one coach in particular say, you know what, when I used to recruit kids, I knew their parents' name, I knew their high school coach. Like I knew everything about them going back to 8th or 9th grade. And yeah, with the high school kids, sometimes we still have the ability to do that. But with some of these kids that come in, we don't have the time to do it before you make a decision. And you're trying to, work all the back channels and figure out if you could talk to people that know them. But at the end of the day, there's not enough time because the decision process is so quick. I mean, if you don't fire on somebody else is gonna. And so often I think it's natural for most people to want to make a decision fairly quick anyway. Like, I want to get this over with and figure out where I'm going to go and see what the right fit, the right package is, and off we go. And it doesn't necessarily allow for the traditional recruiting, hey, let's get to know each other, that used to be so important in that process. I mean, I know it was when I was getting recruited 30 years ago. Like, I want to know who the coaches are. I want to know the history of the program. I want to be able to take 2 or 3 days and be on campus and see exactly what you're going to experience. For a lot of these guys, they're going for a year. And so that, it's not necessarily the 3, 4, 5 year experience that you were getting before. And it's not bad. I'm not saying it's bad.
Yeah.
It's just different. Mm-hmm. It's just very different. And immediacy is so important with the way that the portal works now that, and there's plenty of back channel stuff. I mean, it always happens to where somebody's going before they do go, and you're not going to change that. I don't care what you try to do. But this is the process that we have right now. And are there ways that we can tweak it moving forward, make it easier for players and coaches? Yeah, probably. I mean, that's why I think waiting a few weeks to open the portal up would be a good idea. But for those banging the table saying we need NIL to go away and it ain't leaving. It may end up looking different down the road, but it ain't leaving. And ultimately, I mean, it's the greatest country in the world. Like, if somebody wants to pay to do something, that's their money. They can pay you to do that. And I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. Now we're just seeing, the way that whether it's fan bases or collectives or programs themselves actually value players. That's called an economy. That's the way that our place works. And some have more money than others, and it makes it easier for them to go out and throw more money around, but it doesn't mean they're going to be right. I mean, there's still a value in player identification and figuring out who the right fits are. But yeah, it's a crazy system. And if I went to Mark was 5 years ago and said, hey, this is what this is going to look like, and he was my longtime head coach at Stanford, I mean, his head would spin. Like, what? We're having to pay guys to stay and play at Stanford, and if we don't, then potentially we're going to lose a few of them, and they have lost a few of them. I mean, obviously, Braden Montgomery's got 15 home runs at A&M right now. He'd fit pretty good in the lineup that hadn't been great so far this year at Stanford. But that's I mean, LA's been on both sides of it, right? You lose Tommy White after having one of the best freshman seasons that we've seen in the last, maybe since Pat Burrell. So it sucks some days, and there's other days that it comes back to benefit you.
Yeah. It's so interesting, and I don't bring all this stuff up as sort of a throw my hands up like I think some do, and they're like, well, what's a coach supposed to do? I bring it up because it's what we've got, so we got to deal with it. So as people who watch games and talk about it and love the game and are fans of it, like, you gotta know what's happening and how the landscape is. But B, it's fascinating to me when coaches go and find the right fit. I think it is exposure for coaches in an even more meaningful way than simply winning was before. I look at a Chris Pollard at Duke. You talk about the Ivy League guys. That pipeline has been wide open for the Blue Devils. Their starting corner infielders are both having great seasons. Logan Bravo, their first baseman, a transfer from Harvard. Ben Miller at third, maybe my favorite player in the conference. He's just got such a hit tool. He's so fun to watch. And he's a transfer from Penn, who's actually got another year of eligibility after this one if he wants it. The way he's hitting, I don't know that that's going to be the case that he'll stick around. But, like, that's a pipeline that has been wide open for them. We know when BC is good, they utilize sort of the Northeast D3 pipeline. They'll get a grad transfer from one of those. Tim Noon is another one at Duke who's a Babson college transfer. Son of a
Virginia's
coach.
done it. I mean, Virginia's worked that area of the country, and a few D3 guys that have come in. And it's the way that I think, if you're Duke, you're a perfect fit for those types of Ivy transfers. A, you can get them into school. And that's one of the biggest things you got to be able to do on a transfer, because there's just not a lot that you're going to be able to get into school. But B, it's a trap. If you're coming from Penn or Harvard and you're going to get a grad degree at Duke, like, that ain't a bad 5 years. That works. And now we get a chance to potentially compete for an ACC championship and maybe take Duke to Omaha, which they've been so close to doing, a few times over the last 5 or 6 years. That's not that tough of a sell to me. It's a pipeline that I don't think is going to go away.
Yeah. Yeah. Even with the COVID year going away, it seems to me like, look, guys in the Ivy League get medical red shirts, right? Yeah. Just like anywhere else. So that 5th year is going to pop up here or there. And I think more and more often we're going to see it as they transfer before they finish there. I think that's a possibility. Look, Harvard's, I never went, but I imagine it's tough, right? to be able to transfer to Duke and the academic piece becomes a step down is an interesting factor in all of that. But no, it's I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that has been talked about in certain conversations I've had over the past few weeks, just sort of the landscape and how it looks. And you mentioned Virginia, academically very similar to Duke.
Absolutely.
So those two are perfect for that kind of a transfer. Let me leave you with this, KP.
Yeah.
What is the ACC team you're most excited to see? How the next 6 to 8 weeks go for them?
Probably Duke. You talk about that who can get to Omaha discussion that we had earlier, and Duke absolutely fits it, but yet, they're 500 league through the first 4 weeks. And so now what does it look like for Duke the rest of the season? I still think we can look up to the end of the year and Duke is hosting, and if they go on a heater, potentially can be in that top 8 discussion. They're probably out of the top 8 right now, but ultimately they're in the host discussion. But I think Duke is really intriguing. You talked about Chris and what they've done, how close they've been the last few years. I think there's 3 or 4 programs in the country that you look at and you go, okay, when are they going to get there? Wake was on that list. They got there. Duke is on that list. East Carolina's on that list. Dallas Baptist is on that list of those that, man, they've been knocking at the door for like the last 5, 6, 10 years. And for whatever reason, haven't been able to make that jump. I would be shocked if in the next 2 or 3 years, Duke isn't an Omaha team. And it definitely wouldn't shock me if that's the case this year. So, yeah, kind of from what we've seen to what we potentially could see before the end of the year. There's plenty of options in this league, but I would still say Duke. I think, Wake is way intriguing just because of coming off of getting swept and where they sit right now. So I would probably throw them into the conversation. But those two, just because of where they sit right now and what I think is the upside for both of them come the end of the year.
Yeah. Good stuff, man. Appreciate you doing this. What games do you have coming up? You mentioned the SEC work over the weekend. Any ACC teams on your slate coming up?
I don't have any in the next few weeks. I go to Baton Rouge. I've got Vandy LSU this weekend. And then Ole Miss, Mississippi State the following weekend.
Nice.
So, I haven't seen May yet. I don't know what May. I want to get back. I think it's in Clemson at Wake the last regular season. I think they are.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope I can get in town and do that one.
Nice.
And then we'll see what the rest of the slate is. But, yeah, man, this is when it gets fun. It's crazy. It feels like we just started, but yet we're halfway home from a regular season standpoint.
Dude, doesn't it always feel that way, though?
100%.
It's just, you look up, you're like, okay, yeah, baseball's here. And then, like you mentioned, we're halfway through. And next thing you know, we'll be talking about ACC tournament results and how those matter in the big picture of the 64-team field. It's going to be fun. I think the ACC's got a chance to have a a really good number of teams in that field. I mean, we talked about it at the beginning. 8 in the top 25 right now. I think you could safely assume if things were to stay the same, they're in. Yeah. You talked about Miami. We didn't mention BC. That's a team that's
after this weekend. Yeah.
I mean, that's an intriguing team to me, KP, especially when you look at the standings. And for a Northeastern team, we all know the circumstances. Beginning of the season, you got to play elsewhere.
Yep.
BC's 11-6 on the road, 2-1 at neutral sites. That'll do it. That'll do it. And they're teetering near 500. Maybe they can get up to that mark in league play. And who knows? Maybe that's a 10th team in the NCAA regionals, and that would tie a record, right? I think the SEC had 10 last year, and that is the most for a conference in the 64 team field. So who knows, right? Like the possibilities are all over the place.
Well, to your point, I mean, last weekend we probably wouldn't have brought up BC. Yeah. But then you go in and sweep Georgia Tech on the road, and you go, oh, hold it. Now that can kickstart something else. And it's the beauty and sometimes the detriment of what this is. Like a hell of a lot can change in a month. I mean, you got 12 conference games and a few midweeks that make a difference, and you look up. And I think the power top to bottom within the ACC right now is only going to benefit those that at the end of the year are right around 500 in the league, because the league is going to be seen, I think, very positively from a selection standpoint, just because of how balanced it's been. I mean, hell, I know Pitt's 2-10, but in the league, I mean, Pitt went out to Vegas and beat a couple pretty good teams in non-conference stuff, and you come back and they haven't had the greatest luck when it comes to. But if that's your lower level team, a Notre Dame team that won 2 out of 3 a few weekends, like I think against Miami at home, there's no gimme weekends, and that only benefits you as a league as you get down to the end of the year.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, friend. Good stuff. Appreciate it. Good to see you. Hope we can make it happen again soon. Maybe sometime before Omaha and the College World Series get here. But at the very least, I would expect maybe then. I don't have definitive plans, but I'm trying. It's my first full season with the D1 guys, so we're trying to grease some wheels and get me to Omaha this year. We'll see.
Let me see if I could talk to a few people.
That's it. That's what I needed. All right, Kyle. Appreciate you, man. Everybody, thanks for listening. This has been ACC Baseball Etc. Reminder on social media at ACC BSB ETC. You know where to find us wherever you podcast, and a gentle nudge. Go rate and review. Do that sort of thing. It helps. I can't explain how or why, but it does. Joe Healy joins me later this week. We're going to do the all nickname team in the ACC. So sorry you missed out on that one, KP.
No, you got walk-off songs last week, and you get the all nickname team this week. So bring the boring old guy into the middle of it, and it fits out pretty well.
Well, I know you'll be listening, so I hope you have fun with that one as much as Joe and I will. So, all right, everybody. We will talk to you later this week, Joe Healy and I, with the all nickname team in the ACC. Thanks again to Kyle Peterson. We'll catch you again soon.